So the problem and the promise we face with the logos is it's a polysemous term and construct, and both at the level of the way the term is used and the concept that it's trying to reflect. The problem, of course, is we face threats of equivocation or idiosyncratic associations. The promise is we could coordinate the meetings to get to a deeper reality. There's something going on. There seems to be a cognitive dimension to logos, and it seems to be coupled to an ontological dimension that seems to have something to do with an intimacy between intelligibility and realness. Um, and this is happening at a very primordial level, often regarded as sacred. All of this is floating around, and can we try and make sense of it? And I propose using the integration of the work of William Desmond as a philosophical framework and cognitive science, especially 4E cognitive science, third generation cognitive science, which dovetails very nicely with Desmond's work in order to try and avoid the problem and realize the promise. So Desmond argues for sort of four primary senses of being, and I think we can extend that into logos because of the intimacy between logos and being. And so I'm going to propose that we go through those four senses and apply them to sort of different historical epochs that have tried, including our own, have tried to understand logos. So just let's quickly, what are the four senses that Desmond talks about? The first is the univocal. This is the sense that there's one universal, completely generalized meaning to being, or in our case, logos. We're talking about a univocal, universalizable thing. Of course, the univocal is the driving framework of modernity, where we reject two worlds, the supernatural and the natural. We reject that dichotomy. The natural world is supposedly self-contained and self-explanatory, and then you frame natural science within that understanding, and somehow science is going to be self-contained and self-explanatory. You have two central features of that univocal vision. You have a reductionism, because everything has to reduce to the univocal, universal level, that is the real level. Everything that is produced has to be derivable from it. In a certain worldview, that's anything that we claim to be real has to be derivable from our scientific ontologies, the ontologies given to us by physics, chemistry, and biology. Implicitly, what you have is you have a lot of dichotomies that are needed for the practice of science. You have to do the subjective objective dichotomy, the fact value dichotomy, analytic synthetic dichotomies. And we'll come back to this later. Now, these dichotomies have been progressively dissolved within analytic philosophy, Putnam, Quine, etc., and of course postmodern thought, especially Derrida, Foucault, etc. And more recently, reductionism itself has been subject to some very powerful criticisms. And that has led to a sense of the collapsing of the framework of modernity and the ushering in of postmodernity. That leads us to Desmond's second sense, which is the equivocal. And what we have in the equivocal state is we have multiple meanings. There's instability of meanings. There's no prioritization, because prioritization brings about privileging, and privileging is to be rejected. And of course, that means there's a cacophony going on. One of the problems with this equivocal state is it falls prey to performative contradiction. Performative contradiction is when your statement contradicts the state or stance from which you're making the statement. A non-controversial example of a performative contradiction is, I am completely unconscious right now. It is, of course, possible. There's nothing inherently false or self-contradictory about John Vervaeke being unconscious, but I have to be conscious to make any statements. And so what happens is within the postmodern, and these, I'm rushing through a lot of critiques here because I'm trying to get through Desmond's taxonomy, but basically you end up privileging something, you end up prioritizing something, for example, it might be social justice, or it might be the written text is taken as absolutely real, or something like that. And so you get performative contradictions building up. Desmond says what people frequently do, and you can see this in what's called metamodernism, is you get what's called the dialectical approach, in which you're trying to integrate the many meanings and the one meaning together, and you're trying to do this through creating a system. And the idea is that the differences eventually fold back into the univocal, and the differences were just the differentiation of the identity. And so the sort of paradigmatic hero of that kind of move is Hegel, and the idea of a systematization that reconciles the two together. The problem with this idea of identity finally trumping difference, according to Desmond, is that difference comes to be seen as again as in some way subservient to identity. And this, of course, leads to the famous critiques made by first Kierkegaard, but also by Levinas, that what we end up with is a totalization that actually blinds us to infinity, and thereby disconnects us radically from reality rather than restoring us to reality. So Desmond then argues that we move to what he calls the metaxological. This comes from Plato, metaxu, the between, and he also reads meta in two senses, within or between and beyond. And I've argued elsewhere that we can also call this the dialogical as opposed to the dialectical. And here, what you try to do is you try to hold all of these terms in a relation of porous polarity with each other. You don't try to resolve the tension into any system. Instead, what you're trying to create is a symphonic sense in which you're invoking both senses at the same time. No, you're not reducing one sense to the other, you're holding them together. A prototypical example, which I make use of, is the work of Nishida, and thankfully the English translation works. Nishida uses the word realization to mean both an awareness of understanding and actualization in reality. And he means both senses at the same time, not prioritizing one over the other, but holding them together. I do exactly the same thing when I talk about relevance realization. So now let's move and take a look at logos through these different, what you might call them, epochs or ways of understanding the meaning of being. We have had a univocal approach to the logos, and that is modernity, where the proposal there is logos is reducible to logic. This can be universalized as computation. And this, of course, was the view of what is known as first generation cog-sci, that cognition is computation. Now, it is then linked to the idea that is born at the same time as the idea of cognition as computation, the scientific revolution, that computation is the way in which we best represent reality. And you have a representational notion of knowing. And we see these two coming together in the AI and the AGI proposals. Now, by computation, I want to be clear, I don't mean the trivial sense, anything that can be simulated on a computer. Computers are universal Turing machines, or at least approximations, and we can simulate the solar system using calculus on our computer. That doesn't mean the solar system is doing calculus. So you have to be careful what you're doing there. So I mean something not trivially the case. I mean the deeper sense in which computation is realized by the logical manipulation of propositional representations. Propositions are things that can be evaluated for being true or false. Logical manipulation of propositional representations within a formal system, a self-contained system like logic. That's the defining feature of a formal system. It is self-contained. You get rules for moving the tokens around, and then the reconfiguration of the tokens tells you which rules you should then consult, and the system just runs. That's why it's called a purely formal system. You don't need to know anything about it. So by an instance of this, the pieces on the chessboard don't have to refer to anything other than the relationship to the other pieces of the chess board in order for me, the game of chess, in order for me to play chess. Chess is a formal game. It implements a limited formal system. Okay, so the problem is that this version of logos that was at the central of computational cognition and first generation cog-sci has fallen into a lot of serious criticisms when you try and explain fundamental features of cognition. So, for example, cognition relies on categorization. We have to categorize things in order to make sense of the world, make the world intelligible. Categorization seems to be a basic process. Now, the problem with categorization is it relies on things being regarded as similar to each other. Cats are all similar to each other. Dogs are similar to each other. Cats and dogs are dissimilar in some way. The problem is, and this is Goodman's famous argument from 1972, is you can't get a logical account of similarity. Why? Well, because similarity means partial identity, and partial identity means sharing a lot of predicates. And then, as Goodman pointed out, you pick any two objects, and the number of true predicates they share is uncountably vast. So a plum and a lawnmower both have curved surfaces. They both have an odor. They both contain carbon. They're both found in North America. Neither one makes a particularly good weapon. Both weigh more than a paperclip. I can go on and on and on and on and on. So logically, any two things are equally similar. They're also equally dissimilar. So at the logical level, similarity can't get you, there's no notion of similarity that can get categorization going. And what people then turned to was, well, what we have to do is we pick out the relevant factors of comparison, and it's only in terms of the relevant factors that you have shared properties. And then that means that your categorization is actually dependent on this unexplained process of relevance realization. And that is where that goes. Now, you might then say, well, I can get out of this by having concepts, and I can be an Aristotelian, and a concept has an essence. There's a set of necessary and sufficient conditions. The problem with that, Wittgenstein, what are the necessary and sufficient conditions for being a game, for being a chair, right? And so on and so forth. And the thing is, you can't come up with a definition that includes all and only chairs and all and only games and excludes things that are not games and all that sort of thing. And so what does that mean? Well, that means most of our concepts aren't born out of essence. They're dependent, again, on how we use our terms, and that use is governed by our judgments of appropriateness, our forms of life, which are, again, judgments of what's relevant in this situation, how is it relevant, what is the context. Context is a term for saying what is relevant beyond what is captured in your text. Attention. How do we capture attention? The problem is you can pay attention to an astronomically vast amount of information without or within. Somehow you ignore most of that information and zero in on the relevant information, relevance realization. Well, at least we can use representations. The problem is representations are aspectualized. They give a specificity of reference. So I can represent this as a metal thing, as a tool, as a water bottle, as something I can use to stand for the letter I. I cannot grasp in any representation, this is John Searle's argument, all of its properties. They are indeterminately vast. So I select the ones that are relevant in the situation, and therefore I'm back to relevance realization. Now notice how I show each one of these is dependent on relevance realization and therefore cannot be the generative cause of relevance realization. Well, rule following, at least rule following. The problem with rules is they don't specify their own conditions of application. Be kind. Okay, the way I'm kind to my son, is that the way I should be kind to my student? Is that the way I should be kind to my romantic partner? Is that the way I should be kind to a stranger? No. Oh, well, what I'll need is a rule for how I apply that rule when I'm with my son or a stranger. And then I get a combinatorial explosion of rules. So rule following ultimately depends on judgments of what's appropriate, relevant, fits the context. Inference. The number of implications of any proposition is uncountably large. This is Fodor's argument. So, tomorrow it will be windy. What do I infer from that? All possible implications, all possible relations to other propositions? No. I will make certain inferences if I'm going to go sailing tomorrow that are different from the ones I'm going to go if I'm going to stay in and watch a movie, that are different from the ones if I'm going to have a picnic, right? So again, inference is selecting from all the logically possible implications, which ones you're actually going to draw into your cognition and your action. It depends on relevance realization. And Fodor makes the very clear argument that that means no proposition, in terms of its logical identity, can capture relevance, because the logical identity is constant while the relevance of the proposition is constantly varying. So I can do the same thing for memory. Read my 2012 paper, read even my dissertation from 97. Memory is not like computer memory. It is inherently reconstructive. Things are put together in terms of their relevance to each other. And long-term memory, you chunk things in working memory in terms of how they are relevant to each other insofar as they are relevant to you. Memory is drenched in relevance realization. Communication, pragmatics. In pragmatics, this is Grice. I have to rely not on just the implications, but the implicatures. I have to assume people are trying to cooperate with me if they're communicating. This leads to all of Grice's maxims of quality and quantity, etc. Sperber and Wilson have successfully, to most people's mind, argued all the maxims reduce to be relevant. So I determine what you're implicating by trying to determine what you consider relevant and what I consider relevant above and beyond what you're saying. That's how I get what you're conveying beyond what you're saying. We drew all this together, and there's a lot of publications for all of this and a lot of formal presentations. In the 2024 paper published in Phenomenology, no, this was Frontiers, I can't remember. But the basic idea goes back to Savage from 1952, or is it 54? Sorry. At the Foundations of Statistics. And he said, the thing you're trying to do in statistics, whenever you're trying to apply any formal system, statistical theory, probability theory, computational theory, logical theory, etc., you need a small world. You need a world that is clear. You need a world that is well-defined. You need a world in which there's probability and risk. And he said the problem is the large world, or what he called the grand world, which sounds really, really nice, is that it is actually inherently ambiguous. It's inherently ill-defined. It has real uncertainty because it has radical and real emergence, and it has real surprise in it. And so he said, what we're always having to do is translate the large world into a small world upon which we can then operate computationally. And he said about that. And the point that we make is that translation process is exactly what relevance realization is, which means it can't be captured by a formal system, because if you try and say it's governed by a formal system, you get a third man infinite regress. And you can't get any formal system to capture the large world for Gödelian reasons, and for also reasons that you can't get from one logic to another by running the computation of one logic. I can't get to predicate logic by manipulating proposition. I can do all the calculations, all the computations in propositional logic. I won't get predicate logic. I can do all the computations in predicate logic. I won't get modal logic, and so forth. And so if you want to get the more technical arguments, they're handled in depth. What it is that, right, it comes down to is that computation, strictly defined, can't capture relevance realization. It's more primordial. It's deeper than representations, deeper than propositions, deeper than inference, deeper than rule following, deeper than categorization, deeper than paying attention. And so this gives us an alternative proposal that logos is actually that act of relevance realization, the bringing things together so they belong together and make sense to us so that we fit the world in a certain fashion. Now, many people are converging on this in what's called 4E cog-sci, which is third generation cognitive science. So first generation is cognition is computation. That gets challenged by neural networks that are like at the level of explanation, not at the level of implementation, but at the level of explanation, um, they are not computational. They are not using subject predicate relations. Um, that was only a hybrid stage because it turned out that people came to realize what matters isn't the neural network. What matters is the dynamical system running on the neural network. And so what you do is you move to this new model, and relevance realization is a prototypical example of 4E cog-sci. It's dynamical, it's evolving. And the important thing is that relevance realization, it's like adaptivity, like biological adaptivity. The adaptivity of the shark is not in the shark. I drop it in the desert, it's dead. It's not in the ocean. I drop you in the ocean, you're dead. It's a relationship of fittedness. It's an affordance. The graspability of this is not in this. Fly can't grasp it. It's not in my hand because I can't grasp the sun. It's in the relationship of fit. So you get real relations of fit that are neither subjective nor objective. I've coined the term transjective to try and talk about this. You also get that it starts to undermine not only the subjective objective dichotomy, it starts to undermine all the dichotomies. For example, the fact value dichotomy gets undermined by this. Is relevance a fact? What I mean is this is always relevant. It's an objective property of it. No. Is it just a subjective value? No, I can be wrong about what's relevant and it kills me. So again, and you can read Putnam and others about this, the collapse of the fact value dichotomy. Quine demolishes the analytic synthetic dichotomy. Take a look at Prickstock's book, Aspects of Truth, in which she marshals all this together. And she says basically what happens is when you get rid of all the dichotomies, you get rid of the representational notion of cognition and you return back to a conformity notion, a notion of things being coupled together via something like a dynamical system as being the proper model for cognition. And so this is why many people, this is why cognition is embodied, embedded, enacted, and extended. It's not computation done in your head. It's a dynamical system in the way you're coupled to the world. And now the important thing about that is relevance realization is therefore neither algorithmic nor is it merely arbitrary. It's between those. That's another dichotomy that is dissolved. And that means it demonstrates what Frankfurt calls voluntary necessity. We feel bound by what we judge relevant, but nevertheless, we don't lose our agency. And this is what we find, this is Searle's argument, this is what we find in reason. A good argument is compelling, but it's not compulsive. Beauty is compelling, but we're not losing our agency, but finding fulfillment in it. Love is compelling, but we're feeling free. And so there's this nexus of like at the core of voluntary necessity. And I think that's ultimately pointing towards the primordiality of relevance realization. Notice that many of these things are the processes we think bring us closer into contact with what is real, make the world intelligible to us in different ways, and yet somehow they are all bound together. So I think I've done enough with the modernist understanding of logos as logic. We then say, well, does that lead us into the postmodern view of Derrida, where logos is basically something like deference, right? Where what we're constantly doing is, right, and he's making use of Saussurean linguistics, which is problematic because there's been no good way of reconciling Saussurean and Chomskyan linguistics, but I'll put that aside for the linguists to address. They're constantly wrestling with that one. Regardless, the idea is whenever I'm trying to get at what this is, make it intelligible, make sense of it, I'm deferring to something that is different from it. So he creates this term. Notice how it's polysemitic, semitic, semic. what's the word here? It's polysemous in the way we're talking about here. He's invoking both the sense of deferring and different and difference. And both of these are right happening all the time whenever we're trying to make sense of a text. And of course, the text bleeds out into its margins and it bleeds out into other texts. And there's nothing outside of the text and so forth. Um, I can't argue it right now. I've argued it extensively elsewhere. So I'm going to appeal to an intuitive point. Difference is relevance realization. We're constantly that well, this is relevant to this, which isn't identical to this. That's relevant to this, that's relevant to this. And that is what I think difference is actually doing. Now, the thing about that, and I think I agree with Derrida on this, is he says the force of this is not found in the text, right? You can't capture it. And of course, this leads to some very problematic moves, I think, in in sort of decadent popular uptakes of postmodernism, where that force of difference is understood as saying that all that's really real is power or something like that. Logos is power is the proposal that's coming out here. But when you think about it as relevance, and it's the force, the voluntary necessity of relevance rather than some imposing power, then you can get a much more positive notion of what's going on from the postmodern perspective. And we don't have to fall into what Dylan criticizes Derrida for, which is a semiological reductionism, the idea that that's all that's real is somehow the text and the privileging of writing and the privileging of the propositional, the so-called logocentrism that's at the heart of Derrida's critique. And the reason why we can make that move is we can, and again, this is a lot of publications, a lot of work. I can point people to, got a paper that's going into submission right now explicitly on this. Relevance realization, and this is back to Fodor's point, you can't capture it with propositional logical relations. So most of relevance realization is below propositional knowing, knowing something is the case, like cats are mammals. It's also knowing how to do something, like knowing that, not knowing that cats are mammals, but knowing how to interact with a cat. It's a very different thing, as many of you have probably encountered when you first met cats. Hetherington has a great book out called How to Know, which gives very powerful arguments about why knowledge that is reducible to know-how. You can then make similar arguments about how that procedural knowing, knowing how, depends on your ability to orient, knowing what it's like to be you here now in this state of consciousness, knowing what it is like. And that gives you a touchstone. I need to know if I'm properly oriented, to know if I'm doing it right when I'm trying to learn my skill or apply my skill. And Kant bumps up against that, by the way, way back in the critique. Like he realizes he realizes that there's no way of propositionally distinguishing the left hand from the right hand. And he says, but we have to orient whenever we're doing anything, whenever we're trying to reason. And yet I can't capture orientation propositionally. And that's because it's perspectival. It has to do with how your state of consciousness is foregrounding and backgrounding, rendering some things more salient than others, so you can do the relevance realization that is necessary for your cognition. And that gives you a sensed presence in the world. And that ability to orient is dependent on the fact that you can couple to the world. You're embodied and embedded. Your biology has and the physics of the world have co-emerged in such a way that you are fitted to the world and the world is fitted to you, and you get that sense of belonging, that sense of fittedness. That's participatory knowing. That is knowing by being coupled to something. And each one of these knowings has, behaviorally, possibly even anatomically, different kinds of memory, different phenomenological senses of realness. Propositional is conviction, skill is power, perspectival is sense presence, participatory knowing is belonging. So I'm proposing to you that logos is deeper than the propositional. It reaches into and from the non-propositional. This is lining up with a lot of third way Platonism, the work of Gonzalez, Hyland, Kirkland, Rutnick, Rusin, others, that Plato is prioritizing the non-propositional over the propositional. and therefore it's prioritizing insight over inference. In fact, insight and inference are in opponent relations. You have to sort of weaken inferential processes to afford insight. That's why mindfulness affords insight and flow. You also get this primordial lower level and the work of Mithrin and other cognitive anthropologists and cognitive archaeologists. I'm a little bit hesitant about that, but let's keep going, which is, that we find it natural that music and language go together, and music and gesture, that's song, music and gesture, that's dance, right? And that language and pictures go together, and music and pictures and gesture and language, I'm doing it. And so there's this sort of logos we have that is the common ancestor that from which all of these emerged. And we know that that can go wrong. Ratcliffe does work on this in his book Feelings of Being, on what he calls existential feelings, because that sensed presence of participation can go wrong, even though all the procedural and, more importantly, all the propositional information is intact. So people can have Capgras syndrome, which is they are convinced that all of their familiars, let's say their wife and kids, that's not them anymore. They've been replaced by robots. Or they can have Cotard. I'm here, but I'm actually disembodied, or I'm dead, or I'm non-existent. They will admit the truth of all of the propositions, but the sensed presence of participation is suddenly absent, and the realness goes away, and you get depersonalization, you get derealization phenomena. It's a really excellent book to look at. What about the dialectical? I'm almost done. We can see that in sort of the work of Dawkins and Dennett, in which everything is going to be reduced to a kind of biologic. Everything folds back into evolution, which folds back into the algorithmic machinery of genetics, or the purely arbitrary power of the environment. And that's sufficient and for explaining everything. And we get that kind of reduction. But as I hope Michael has shown you, that view that, life is completely bottom up from the genes, we have to bring in a top down to make good sense of it. There's other people doing work on niche construction where the environment and the organism are coupled together and mutually shaping each other. We have Hole's work showing that the levels have a causal and informational reality to them. We have the fact that science uses categories that have to have essences. This is Quine, because it's trying to make universal generalizations. But all the work, think about Larry Lawden and all the philosophers, and right, there is no essence to science. There isn't even an essence to the scientific methods. There's a family of methods. There's a family of what we mean by science. There is no essence, so you can't actually do a science of science. So you don't want to say that science doesn't exist because it can't be scientifically explained. You don't want to say the scientists don't exist because they use mind, meaning morality, meaning normativity, and math, and those don't fit from the bottom up. So you get what Frank Gleiser and Thompson and have called the blind spot, what Vervaeke has argued is an ontological whole. We have to give that up, and instead we have to move to a dialogical view that's given to us by relevance realization, which the logos is metaxou. It's metaxou this way, between the inner and the outer, the organism and the environment. It's metaxou this way, between these real levels. They're not just epistemic, they're real. Bottom-up causation, top-down constraint, very broadly construed to take into account some of Mike's work. This is a dialogical model of logos. And it says that there's a deep conformity, a deep coupling, a deep porous participation between the grammar of cognition, relevance realization, and the grammar of reality, reality realization. These two bottom up, top down, that are porously participating in each other. They're coupled together. They share the same fundamental grammar and principles. So reality realization bleeds into relevance realization, and relevance realization bleeds into reality realization. And that is my proposal for what we should understand logos to be. Thank you very much. for staying with me through that. And I hope I was okay. My sense of my own presence is wobbling right now because of my Meniere's. But there we go.
Thank you, John, for an amazing talk. Would you like to take a couple of questions to?
Sure. And I don't know, is it possible to maybe switch the view again so I can see,
Yeah,
or does it,
of course. Yes, yes.
yeah,
You will see the room.
yes,
And
thank you.
maybe people who ask a question, maybe they can move so that John could see them somewhere over there. Okay, so who would like to ask a question or make a comment? Maybe I can start us off by asking you whether, well, your grounding of logos in the non-propositional,
Yes,
and I know that you're using a Neoplatonic framework, and we have already had a discussion before you started about dianoia and noesis.
yeah.
So does your view sever the relationship between logos and language? How would you? Because of course, we in the tradition there is a very strong connection, or even an identification between logos and its linguistic expression in the Platonic tradition. But you seem to limit this relationship. How would you respond to that?
Well, I mean, there's also elements in the tradition that I could appeal to. Heraclitus, don't listen to my words, but listen to the logos, and all things are one. And that the lyre has logos and the bow has logos. So there's also been a tradition of understanding the logos non-linguistically running through. I wouldn't say that. There's no logos to language. That would be a ridiculous claim. It would be a performative contradiction. What I'm saying is, given a lot of these arguments, taking seriously this idea that we can't privilege any one level as having the sole ownership of causation or informational access, and this is what Hull's arguments, the one with Tononi and the more recent one in 2012, and I think what Mike's work shows is we can't privilege any one of these levels and says this is the level that captures it. I think there are sub-linguistic aspects of logos, and I've tried to articulate these. I think there are super-linguistic aspects. I couldn't get into those. I think human beings form collective systems that are able to realize relevance in the world. Hutchins does, this famously that, what navigates a ship? It's the dynamical system of the people and all the technology that is able to process all the information and deal with something large like a ship in something really large like the ocean. And these collectivities go up and down. And I think Mike's work also points to that. Look, when you move to continuum, you're neither privileging identity nor difference. Continuum is the ontological claim that you can't reduce difference to identity or identity to difference. That is the key move here, and this is the what's central. And so that I'm proposing a continuum idea of logos, which I think is a way of bringing a kind of order to the polysemy without trying to fall into a reduction or an equivocation or a dialectical system in which one level is privileged and all of them somehow get folded back into it. I'm arguing for a continuum that does not do any of that. And I think that's what Desmond and 4E cognitive science is pushing towards.
Thank you. Any questions, thoughts? Douglas?
Greetings,
Douglas,
John.
it's great to hear your voice. I miss you, my friend.
John doesn't see you. So.
Okay, I'll come round.
I have to go the other way.
So I'm going to pick up on, in part, Father Katsos's worries about an anthropomorphic perspective on the universe. Sure. And maybe raise the point that in some sense the tradition of the Logos historically is tied to a theomorphic perspective. That there's a sense in which the human being does have this macrocosmic status, microcosmic status within the macrocosmos. I wonder what I mean, this is sort of pushing you, as it were, in a direction that you hint at from time to time, but with your analysis of Quine and Goodman and Dennett, your sort of often your target are these clearly either philosophers who are pointing in a direction that you're approving of, or those that you think are needlessly reductive. But there does seem to be this theological element to your project. And of course, this notion that there's this theomorphic dimension to the human being is so at odds with so many aspects of our culture, whether it's those that want to say that, well, of course, we're just parts of the animal kingdom like any other, with just a few advantages here and there, or to those who say, well, yes, we're basically machines, and look at what computers do. I mean, clearly I just wonder what you think about this notion of the significance of the logos in terms of this theomorphic dimension of humanity.
I think that you're exactly right to point it there. Notice I did take time to try to seriously criticize we're just a machine or we're just an evolution. It's just evolution. I specifically made those targets because I'm trying to open up a space. So Richard Dawkins famously said, the cell is a model of its environment. If you look at the cell, you can find all the patterns and principles of its environment. That's Richard Dawkins. I don't think he understood the ramifications of that. Or you have Carl Friston, the great proponent of predictive processing, which is like this with relevance realization, one of the big frameworks, saying you don't have a model of the environment, you are a model of the environment. This is a very different thing. You're not wielding representations, you're instantiating patterns and processes that couple you to the environment with an adaptive affording fit. And so I think that this view strongly supports a microcosmic, macrocosmic relationship, both horizontally and vertically. And then, and I'm doing this right now, I just wrapped up the first 8 weeks of a course on seeing God again for the first time. When you demolish these lobotomy dichotomies given to us by modernity, the subjective, the objective, fact value. Like, think about Desmond's argument. The fact value dichotomy gives us default atheism. If you adopt the fact value dichotomy, you're committed to a kind of atheism, because you're saying objective reality has no value, subjective beings project it, which is just an illusion, and they have no ontological significance, which of course is a default nihilism at least. But as you get rid of these dichotomies, analytic, synthetic, is ought, good, you can take a look at case, what those do, and you really return to the phenomenology, which, by the way, I think is really well exemplified by third way Platonism, saying we can actually use Plato to get back into the deep phenomenology of intelligibility. I think you get a pronounced sense of the divine. And I mean, what has been happening to me is a realization that both impersonal and personal ways of having that sense presence of divine are deeply appropriate. They are deeply connective. They give us access to aspects of reality that are otherwise inaccessible. Now, that's a whole other argument, Dr. Douglas, and you're welcome to take my course if you'd like. But I do think, I do think the primordial to the ultimate that relevance realization coupled to reality realization is capable of, the primordial to the ultimate, right, gives us what binds the truth and the true, the good, and the beautiful. Well, how they are relevant to each other, how they interpenetrate each other, right? And so right? That gives us a proper access for talking about the sacred, talking about the divine. I think this view is very strongly supportive of that. But what it does is undermine any simplistic anthropomorphic interpretations of that. Because, yes, the cosmos is mind like, but it also means the mind is cosmos like. That you have to bring both of those into your, and that's what saying the mind is embodied and embedded and enacted and extended, and there's deep continuities between cognition and biology means. So, sorry, that's a long answer, Douglas, but your question, as your questions frequently are, was a profound one.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Okay, if not, thank you, John, once more for your talk and answering these questions. And we're very pleased to be able to listen to your paper.
Thank you very much, everyone. It was a great pleasure. I'm sadly wish I could be here with you or be there with you. There's just
We
some
will
thing.
raise the glass to you this evening in your absence.
Well, I appreciate that. And it seems that whenever Mike is physically present, I have to be virtual, and whenever I'm physically present, Mike has to be virtual. There might be some sort
Mike was also present, only virtually.
there we go. Okay. Thank you, everyone. I'm not going to stay any longer. I have to limit my screen time because of my Meniere's, because it tends to challenge the vertigo a little bit, because it doesn't have all of the real cues. But I do appreciate, I do so much appreciated being invited to this. And again, I want to point to the stellar work that's being done by Matthews, that's being done by Douglas. I think this virtuous attempt, and I think increasingly successful attempt, to bring Platonism in as a living tradition for us here and now is beautiful and needed. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.